I still remember that morning like it's burned into the back of my mind. It was one of those cold, breathless dawns in Riverside when everything feels too quiet, too still, like the world hasn't fully woken up yet. I was half asleep when someone started pounding on my front door, not knocking, pounding, urgent, frantic, like they were trying to drag me out of bed and into something I wasn't ready to face. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 29 years old, born and raised in Riverside, and for most of my life, people here thought they already knew exactly who I was before I ever said a word. I glanced at the clock. 5:04 a.m. Nobody knocks at that hour in this town unless something is seriously wrong. I pulled on my jacket, feet freezing against the old linoleum floor, and walked to the door with that familiar knot in my stomach. The one every kid from our trailer park grows up with. That feeling that trouble always knows your name. When I opened the door, Earl was standing there. He's my neighbor, mid-60s, a quiet Vietnam vet everybody here calls the old stray dog. Keeps to himself, never says much. Most folks laugh at him behind his back. But that morning, he didn't look like someone you should laugh at. He looked terrified. His hands were shaking, his face was pale. And when he finally spoke, his voice cracked just enough to scare me. "Naomi, don't go to City Hall today. No matter what. Don't scan your badge. Don't walk through that door." I froze. It wasn't his words. It was the way he looked at me, like my life was hanging by a thread only he could see. I forced a nervous laugh and tried to brush it off. "Earl, come on. Today's my reporting day. If I miss it, they'll tear me apart." He shook his head so hard I stopped talking. "I'm not joking. Just trust me." And the thing is, as soon as he said that, something deep inside me twisted. Because for weeks I'd been trying to convince myself that the weird things happening were nothing. The black SUV parked across from our row 3 nights in a row, the silent phone calls, the strange emails asking what days I'd be near the archive room. I kept telling myself, it's nothing. Don't make it weird. But suddenly, it didn't feel like nothing. I stood there holding my City Hall badge, that stupid blue card everyone always joked about. "Doesn't matter if you have a badge, Naomi. Folks like you never get far." I'd heard that my entire life. Being the daughter of a woman who overdosed twice makes people think they already know your story. But looking at Earl, the panic in his eyes, I felt something shift. Something was wrong. Really wrong. And in that split second, I knew. If I walked into City Hall that morning, something would happen that I wouldn't walk away from. So, I closed the door, took a deep breath, and made a choice that ended up changing everything. I thought staying home would calm me down, but honestly, it only made the silence louder. The kind of silence where every small sound feels like it's trying to tell you something. The old refrigerator humming, the heater clicking on and off, the gravel crunching under some car driving way too slow outside. It all felt wrong. I tried to make myself a cup of coffee, but my hands were shaking so much I spilled half of it on the counter. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. "Naomi, relax. You did the responsible thing. You stayed home. Nothing bad is going to..." And then the TV cut in with a breaking news alert. City Hall, explosion. Smoke pouring out of the East Wing. Emergency crews everywhere. My mug slipped out of my hand and shattered on the floor, but I didn't even hear it. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think Earl had been right. But the moment I saw the building, something inside me sank, like the floor had dropped out from under my feet. Before I could even process what I was seeing, my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally I'd ignore it, but something told me to pick up. "Ms. Carter?" a cold, official voice said. This is Chief Harper from the Riverside Police Department. We need to ask you a few questions regarding the incident at City Hall this morning. My stomach twisted. I wasn't there, I said immediately, almost too fast, like I was trying to convince myself. But Harper didn't sound surprised at all. We have security footage of your pickup truck arriving at 7:48 a.m. Your employee badge was scanned at the archive room door shortly before the explosion. Several staff members have stated they saw you near that area earlier this week. I swear, for a moment, everything around me blurred. My truck was outside, right outside, keys in my pocket. I hadn't stepped foot out of my home. Chief, I was here all morning. There has to be some mistake. He paused, and I hated how calm he sounded when he said, "Is there anyone who can verify that?" I glanced around my empty trailer, the chipped paint on the walls, the dent in the couch cushion where I always sit. I had no one. No roommate, no partner, no one to vouch for me, and Harper knew it. People like him always know which cracks to press their thumb into. "Miss Carter, someone needs to come speak with you. Don't leave your residence." The way he said it, slow, deliberate, like he already saw me as a criminal trying to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him not everyone from a trailer park is a criminal, but I also knew it wouldn't matter. Guys like Harper only see one thing: your last name, your zip code, the mistakes your family made 20 years ago. After the call ended, I felt this heavy weight settle on my chest. Anger, fear, humiliation, all tangled into one tight knot. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the silent TV screen replaying the explosion, and for the first time in years, I whispered, "Dad, what am I supposed to do?" And I swear, it felt like the air in the room shifted, not warm or comforting, just different. Like something had finally started that couldn't be undone. I don't know how long I sat there on the edge of my bed staring at the blank TV screen, but when the knocking started again, soft this time, steady and controlled, I felt my whole body tense up. I thought it was the police. I thought this was it. But when I cracked the door open, Earl was standing there again. Still in that old denim jacket he's owned since the early 90s, his face serious in a way I'd never seen before. He didn't even wait for me to ask anything. He just said, "Pack a few things. We're leaving, now." I should have questioned him. I should have demanded he tell me what the hell was going on. But something about the way he stood there, shoulders tight, jaw locked, made me follow him without a word. We got into his beat-up Ford Ranger, the one that backfires every time he turns left, and he drove like he knew every second mattered. After a few minutes, I finally spoke. "Earl, what aren't you telling me?" He didn't look at me, but his grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Your dad," he said quietly, "asked me to watch over you, back before he passed." I froze. My father? My father, who I'd always thought was just a tired janitor who worked night shifts at City Hall so he could keep food on our table? "What are you talking about?" I whispered. Earl sighed, the kind of sigh that carries years of things unsaid. Frank wasn't just mopping floors. He saw things. He wrote things down. And he knew someone would come after that truth eventually. I felt like my chest had been punched. Growing up, I'd been embarrassed of my dad's job. Kids at school teased me about having a custodian father, and I let their voices get in my head. I never once thought he was carrying secrets heavy enough to kill him. We drove to a storage facility on the edge of town, one of those cheap ones with rusted doors and gravel everywhere. Earl unlocked unit number 47 like he'd done it 100 times. Inside, it smelled like old paper and dust. There were boxes stacked everywhere, each one labeled in my father's handwriting. Seeing his handwriting again? God, it felt like he was suddenly standing right behind me. Earl handed me a key he'd kept hidden in his boot. "He told me you might need this one day," he said, and for the first time since morning, I felt my throat tighten. I opened one of the boxes, Files, newspaper clippings, printed emails, financial reports from City Hall. My father had been tracking money that disappeared years before, tracing it all the way back to the mayor and to Grayson. And then, tucked between two folders, I found a small notebook. My dad's notebook, the same one he used to carry in his shirt pocket every day. Inside were pages and pages of his handwriting, shaky in some places, furious in others. But one line made my blood run cold. If anything happens to me, they'll go after Naomi next. She's the easiest one to frame. I didn't know whether to cry or scream. All this time, I thought my dad left this world without ever understanding me, without knowing how hard I was trying. But now, standing there in that dusty storage unit, I realized he'd known more than anyone. He'd been fighting a battle alone, quietly, invisibly, because he knew one day I'd be pulled into it whether I wanted to be or not. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I didn't just feel scared. I felt angry. Angry enough to want the truth, no matter what it cost. When I opened the next box and saw the stack of photos, something inside me twisted hard enough to steal my breath. Earl stood quietly behind me, like he already knew what I was about to find. The photos were grainy, clearly from an old security camera, the kind City Hall never bothered to replace. But even with the low quality, I recognized the faces instantly. Mayor Whitman and Elliot Grayson, entering the archive room late at night, carrying a box I had never seen before. They looked relaxed, almost casual, like two men dropping off beer coolers before a fishing trip. And yet everything in the picture screamed wrong. My dad had glued a sticky note on the back of one photo. His handwriting looked rushed, almost trembling. This is where they'll hide it, and one day they'll pin it on Naomi. I swear my hands went cold. I'd spent years telling myself people exaggerated about corruption in this town. But seeing those photos, it stopped being rumors. It became real. Ugly, personal. I kept digging through the boxes, printed emails where Whitman discussed reallocating community funds, handwritten maps of land being bought under shell companies, even a draft speech about revitalizing Riverside, which basically meant kicking out every family from our trailer park. There were newspaper clippings too, articles about fires, accidents, missing paperwork. My dad had circled dates and scribbled notes beside them. The man had been fighting a war, and none of us even noticed. As I read, something else came back to me, a memory I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered being 13, sitting in the passenger seat of Dad's old Chevy when he said, "Kiddo, you ever notice how folks in power don't raise their voices? They don't have to. Quiet people scare me more." Back then, I thought he was being dramatic. Now I understood exactly what he meant. These men didn't scream. They didn't threaten out loud. They erased people, quietly, efficiently, like they were taking out trash. And I knew, deep down, that if they'd had the chance, they would have erased my dad too. Hell, maybe they already had. My throat tightened as I pulled out a USB drive labeled only with one word: backup. Earl exhaled sharply when he saw it. "Frank told me," he muttered, "that if something ever happened to him, that thing right there would explain why." I wanted to plug it into something right then, but Earl stopped me. "Not here, not now. If they're already looking for you, they might be tracking everything." His voice was low, careful, but there was something like fear behind it. Fear not just for me, but for the truth itself. I sank onto an old folding chair in the unit and felt the anger settle into something heavier, something sharper. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was clarity. These men, These supposed leaders of Riverside hadn't just lied or stolen money. They had planned an entire story, a whole narrative where I was the villain, the unstable girl from the trailer park, the perfect scapegoat, disposable, convenient. And the worst part? I could hear their voices in my head, saying it with those polite, fake smiling tones. We're just doing what's best for the town. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't just caught in some unlucky mess. I was their plan, from the beginning. And in that storage unit, surrounded by my dad's handwriting and the ghosts of his warnings, I made myself a quiet promise. They picked the wrong girl to bury. Sitting in that dusty storage unit with all my father's notes spread around me, I felt like the world had finally stopped pretending. Everything I thought I knew about this town, about my father, about myself, it all cracked open at once. And for a minute, I honestly didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to walk out right then, get in my truck, drive straight past the state line, and never look back. Just disappear. People like me, we don't get second chances. We don't win against men in suits who control every damn thing from zoning laws to police reports. Running felt safe. At least safer than waiting for the next blow. But then I looked down at my dad's notebook again, and it hit me right in the chest. That one line he wrote, "They'll go after Naomi next." He hadn't just been scared for me. He had been thinking about how the world would twist the story, how they'd use my background, my mother's mistakes, every rumor they could scrape up to make me look like the perfect criminal. And it made me angry. Not the loud, screaming kind of angry, the quiet kind, the kind that settles deep, like a weight you can't shake off. The kind that makes you say, "All right, enough." I leaned back in the folding chair and thought about all the times I kept my head down. All the times I let people talk to me like I didn't matter. The landlord who sighed every time I was a day late on rent. The cashier at the grocery store who talked slow to me like I couldn't understand numbers. Even coworkers who'd hand me the boring tasks like I should be grateful just to be in the building. I'd spent my whole life trying to prove I wasn't what people assumed. Working twice as hard for half the credit. Swallowing crap with a smile because I thought that was how you fix a reputation you never deserved in the first place. But sitting there, surrounded by evidence of how far these men were willing to go, I realized something I should have understood years ago. No matter how polite I was, no matter how good I tried to be, they had already written the ending for me. They didn't care about my truth. They cared about their story. And in their story, I was supposed to be quiet, convenient, replaceable. That thought flipped a switch in me. Running wasn't an option anymore. Hiding wasn't an option. Hell, playing nice wasn't even on the table. If my dad had fought alone for years, the least I could do was stand my ground now. Earl must have noticed something change in my face because he looked at me and asked, "You okay, kid?" And for the first time all day, I didn't lie. "No," I said, "but I know what I have to do." It wasn't brave. It wasn't some heroic moment. It was more like finally standing up in a room where I'd been sitting on the floor my whole life. I closed my dad's notebook, wiped the dust off the cover, and said quietly, "They picked me because they thought I wouldn't fight." I stood up, met Earl's eyes, and added, "Well, they're about to find out how wrong they were." And just like that, the fear that had been sitting in my chest all morning loosened. Not because things got easier, but because I finally chose to stop running from my own story. Once the decision settled in my chest, heavy, but steady. I felt something click inside me, like a gear that had been rusted for years suddenly grinding back to life. Earl seemed to sense it too, because he didn't say anything dramatic, didn't congratulate me, didn't call me brave. He just nodded like, "All right then, let's get to work." And that tiny, simple nod made the air in the room shift. It wasn't two scared people hiding anymore. It felt like strategy. We stayed in the storage unit late into the afternoon, going through every document, every note my dad left. Earl brought in a thermos of gas station coffee, burnt, bitter, absolutely terrible, but I drank it anyway because somehow it made the whole thing feel real, like we were mechanics fixing something broken. "You can't go to the police," Earl muttered while flipping through a folder. "Harper's in on it. Hell, half the damn department probably is." He said it casually, like he was talking about bad weather, but I could hear the disappointment underneath it. He'd served this country once, believed in things, and now the town he lived in had rotted from the inside out. It was me who brought up the idea of going to the press. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe desperation makes you say things before you think. "What if we find someone outside Riverside?" I said. "Someone who doesn't owe these men anything." Earl stared at me, blinking a few times like he hadn't expected that from me. "Who'd believe you, kid?" he asked softly. And I hated that the question was fair. A girl from the trailer park, accused in a bombing, suddenly waving around files she found? To half the world, that screams guilty. But something in me refused to back down. "Someone will," I said. "Someone has to." That's when I remembered a name. Lauren Price, a young reporter from Columbus who used to come to Riverside chasing stories nobody wanted touched. Rumor was she'd uncovered something big a few years back and got shut down hard for it. Fired, blacklisted, the whole deal. People said she was difficult, which usually just means she didn't roll over when someone told her to. The kind of person my dad would have trusted. Earl didn't like the idea at first. "Press means noise. Noise means attention, and attention means danger." But danger was already in my trailer, in my phone calls, in every lie being told about me. I wasn't safe anywhere. At least with the truth, I had a fighting chance. So I took a risk. I emailed Lauren everything. Not all of Dad's files, just enough to make her curious. Enough to let her know this wasn't some conspiracy theory rant. And then I added one line at the bottom. "If you don't help me, they're going to erase me." I didn't expect her to reply fast. Hell, I didn't expect her to reply at all. But 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Earl glanced over, brows raised. I opened the message, and my heart jumped in a way I couldn't explain. All she wrote was, "Where can we meet?" For the first time in 2 days, hope didn't feel like a weakness. It felt like a weapon. I didn't sleep the night before the town hall meeting. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling of my trailer, listening to the old heater groan like it was begging for retirement. Every few minutes, I'd replay in my head what Lauren told me over the phone. "You have one shot, Naomi. If you speak, speak clearly. If you show evidence, make sure the room can't look away." She wasn't trying to scare me. She was preparing me. And God, I needed it. When we arrived at the Riverside Community Hall, the parking lot was already full. Pickup trucks, SUVs, minivans with fading bumper stickers that said things like, "Proud parent of a Riverside High senior," or "Blue Lives Matter." People stood outside in little judgmental clusters, whispering and pretending they weren't staring at me. Some didn't bother pretending. I heard someone mutter, "Ain't that the Carter girl? The one they're looking at for the explosion?" They said it like I wasn't 10 feet away, like I'd somehow lost the right to hear. Inside, the hall looked the same as every dull meeting I'd ever attended while working for City Hall. The cheap plastic chairs, the scratchy carpet, the fluorescent lights humming like they wanted to die. But tonight, it felt different. There was this buzz in the air. Not excitement, more like hunger. People wanting to know what was going on, wanting a villain to blame, wanting clarity in a way that small towns never fully admit to. Mayor Whitman stood on stage like he owned the building. He wore that smug smile, the one that tries to look friendly but always ends up looking like he just won something you lost. Grayson sat beside him, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd like we were all problems he wanted to solve with money or threats. I felt my hands sweat, and Earl leaned toward me and whispered, "Remember, kid, they're just men, not gods." The meeting started the same way every meeting does. Whitman talking too much, pretending he cared, saying things like, "We're all in this together," even though he hadn't set foot in our part of town in years. But when he mentioned the explosion at City Hall and said, "We believe the suspect may be unstable," Lauren shot me a look that said, "Now," so I stood up. For a second, the room didn't react. I guess people didn't expect the unstable suspect to show up in person. Then the whispers started rippling through the chairs, sharp and slicing. Whitman tried to keep talking, but my voice cut through the room before he finished his sentence. "You forgot to mention something, Mr. Mayor," I said. "You forgot to tell them the part where you and Mr. Grayson were in the archive room the night before the explosion." He froze. It was beautiful, in a sick way, like watching a snake lose its ability to slither. Then I held up the photos, the ones of him and Grayson carrying boxes into the archive room. The ones taken by the old city camera they thought didn't work. Gasps filled the hall. Someone stood up in the back. Someone else whispered, "Holy hell." Whitman's face went gray. Grayson shifted like he was trying to decide whether to sit or run. "Those photos are fabricated," Whitman said, voice shaking just enough to betray him. "This girl is confused, probably manipulated." I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I didn't even raise my voice. I just laid out the documents, one by one. Dad's notes, the dates, the emails, the missing money, the land schemes, the forged signatures. The truth filled the room like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to unsee. And when I played the audio, the recording Dad made of Whitman and Grayson planning to blame someone from the trailer park if anything went wrong, silence hit the room so hard it almost echoed. People looked at me differently, not like trash, not like the suspect, but like someone they suddenly owed an apology to. Whitman tried to talk again, but his voice cracked like old wood. Harper, the police chief, slipped out the side door, probably calling someone to save himself, and Lauren stood near the exit, live streaming everything to thousands of people watching. That was the night Riverside finally looked me in the eye, and they didn't see what they expected. They saw the truth, and the truth scared the hell out of them. The night after the town hall felt strangely quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath. I sat outside my trailer on the old wooden steps, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of the highway, trying to process everything that had happened. Earl sat beside me, sipping one of those cheap canned coffees he swears taste better cold, even though they absolutely don't. Neither of us talked for a long time. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt earned. The next morning, my phone blew up. Missed calls, voicemails, messages from numbers I didn't recognize, reporters from Columbus, emails from legal aid groups, a text from my old high school teacher saying, "I'm proud of you, Naomi. I should have said that years ago." Even the sheriff from the neighboring county called to tell me they were opening an investigation into Harper, Whitman, and Grayson. It was surreal, watching a town that had spent my whole life looking down on me suddenly scramble to rewrite their memories. I know people like to pretend they always believed in you once the truth comes out, but there were a few moments that genuinely surprised me. Like Mrs. Thompson, The grocery store clerk who once accused me of switching prices when I was 13, showing up at my trailer with a homemade pie and tears in her eyes. Or Joey Parker, the guy who used to throw rocks at our trailer when he was a kid, telling me, "I didn't get it back then, but you didn't deserve any of that." It wasn't forgiveness I was looking for, but hearing those things, it softened something in me I didn't even realize had hardened. And then there was Lauren. She showed up at the trailer park 2 days after the meeting, dusty boots, messy ponytail, recorder still in her pocket. She handed me a folder full of documents her newsroom had already pulled. State-level investigations, subpoenas, records that backed up everything my dad had tried to expose. "You did good," she said simply. Not dramatic, not emotional, just the truth. And it meant more than any applause ever could. But the moment that stayed with me the most happened later that week. I took Dad's notebook to the empty lot at the edge of Riverside, the one he used to park at after long shifts, where he'd sit in the truck and stare out at the town lights. I used to think he did that because he was tired. Now I know he did it because he carried the weight of the whole damn place on his shoulders. I sat there with the notebook in my lap and whispered, "I finished it, Dad."
The thing you started. I didn't do it perfect, but I did it. The wind picked up, blowing dust around my boots, and for a second, I swear I felt him there. Not like a ghost, more like a memory finally settling in its right place. That week, with settlement money from the state and support from Lauren's network, Earl and I opened a small community fund in Dad's name. Nothing huge, just enough to help kids from the trailer park pay for GED classes or community college applications. The first donation came from someone I never expected, the mayor's former assistant, who quit her job the morning after the meeting and wrote, "Your father inspired me more than he knew." And that's when I realized something. This whole time, I thought the fight was about clearing my name. But really, it was about reclaiming my life. Not the life people assigned me, not the story they had ready to bury me under, but the one I chose. I'm not saying everything magically became perfect. This town still has cracks. People still have their opinions. But when I walk down Main Street now, they look me in the eye. They see me, not the Carter kid, not the suspect, not the girl from the trailer park. They see someone who told the truth even when it cost her everything. And for the first time in my life, that's enough. At its heart, this story reminds us that silence is not the same as peace, and endurance is not the same as dignity. Many of us grow up believing that if we just keep our heads down, work hard, and stay out of trouble, life will eventually do right by us. But the truth is, injustice doesn't disappear simply because we ignore it. Sometimes the world pushes people into quiet corners, not because they're weak, but because it benefits those who prefer the silence. Naomi's journey shows that standing up for yourself doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with telling the truth, even when your voice shakes. It's about recognizing when a relationship, a workplace, or a whole community has stopped seeing you for who you are and started seeing you as something convenient to blame or dismiss. Her story also reminds us that courage doesn't always feel bold. Sometimes it feels like fear that refuses to run away. And sometimes the people who help us reclaim our sense of worth aren't the loudest or the most powerful, but the ones who show up quietly, consistently, and without asking for credit. As the old American saying goes, a crooked stick throws a crooked shadow. Once we learn to spot where the shadows come from, we can finally stop blaming ourselves for standing in them. So as you reflect on this journey, I invite you to think about the moments in your own life when you found your voice, or when you wish you had. What did this story stir in you? Have you ever faced a situation where speaking up changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give it a like to support the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more dramatic, thought-provoking stories like this one. Wishing you clarity, courage, and a little peace on your path, wherever it leads.